Previously, on horror, on Cedar Block. Cedar Block has awakened. The soil no longer sleeps. The ancestors no longer whisper, they scream. Sam Carter has walked through fire and memory, forced to confront the sins of his bloodline. The mirror revealed the truth. His family didn't just suffer the curse, they helped create it. Papa Legba has stepped fully into the game. At the crossroads, Sam was tempted with power, shown visions of betrayal, sacrifice, and a legacy soaked in blood. The bone key has fused with his flesh, binding him to something ancient, something hungry. The spirits are rising. The dead are watching, and the debt that was buried beneath Cedar Block is coming due. Now, drawn by a letter signed in bone and ink, Sam returns to the abandoned chapel, because tonight, the whispers stop. Tonight, he meets the devil at the altar. And this time, it's not about revenge. It's about the deal.
It's horror on Cedar Block. Horror on Cedar Block.
Chapter 9. Echoes beneath the floorboards. The Carter house had always creaked, groaned, and settled in the night. But lately, the noises weren't just the house. Sam could feel it, the deep thudding beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat buried alive, vibrating through the soles of his feet and settling into his very marrow. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, wet thump-thump that seemed to sync with his own pulse, drawing the blood to the surface of his skin until he felt flushed, feverish, and perpetually on edge. Mama Mars had stopped sleeping altogether. She sat in her high-backed chair, her bones warning her of a shift in the air that felt like the coming of a great, dark tide. Her skin looked like parchment stretched over a skull, and her eyes, once sharp, were now unfocused, reflecting a world Sam couldn't see. "They're not resting," she whispered into the rising steam of her herbal tea, which smelled increasingly of swamp mud and stagnant iron. "The ground remembers too much, Sam. And it's hungry for the parts of us that still have heat." Micah's dreams were becoming more vivid, more visceral, a nightly descent into a theater of gore and forbidden longing. He saw himself walking barefoot across blood-soaked wood that felt like velvet between his toes, a door at the end of a hallway breathing in rhythmic, wet gasps. In the dream, Papa Legba stood in the corner, a silhouette of jagged edges, smiling with teeth that never ended. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply watched Micah with a gaze that felt like a physical weight, a voyeuristic pressure that made Micah wake up shivering and slick with a sweat that smelled of copper. Down in the cellar, the walls wept. No one had gone down there in decades, not since the first binding ritual failed, and the family had tried to bury the shame behind a padlocked door. Now, the symbols etched into the stone began to glow faintly, a bruised purple light that pulsed with energy. The stone felt like skin, warm, yielding, and damp. It didn't just vibrate. It groaned, a low, guttural sound of tectonic plates grinding against bone, waiting centuries to be felt again. Sam's journal had begun writing back to him notes that weren't in his own handwriting, filled the margins in a frantic, spidery script. He asked questions, his pen trembling, and the ink responded in riddles that felt like a hot breath against his ear. The ink didn't just sit on the page. It moved, slithering into stories of enslaved men buried in chains that had grown into their very skeletons, of a fire that burned the soul but didn't consume the meat, of sacrifices made under a blood moon that turned the air into wine. The journal grew warm in his hands some nights, a radiating heat that made his palms ache with a phantom desire to hold it tighter on others. It pulsed with a heavy, wet throb, as if a literal heart had been sewn between its leather covers. A loose board near the fireplace shifted, the wood splintering back like a broken rib to reveal a locket that didn't belong to anyone still living. It was heavy, tarnished gold that felt greasy to the touch. Inside it, a tiny, sharp tooth and a lock of coarse hair, both humming with a cursed energy that vibrated against the air. Serenity touched it once, her fingers grazing the gold, and dropped it instantly with a strangled cry. Her hand blistered on contact, the skin bubbling into the shape of a screaming face. She looked at Sam, her eyes wide with a terrifying blend of agony and a sudden, sharp arousal born of pure adrenaline. And on the walls, shadows danced with no source. They didn't just move, they interacted. They laughed with the sound of dry leaves in a throat. They wept with the sound of rain on a tin roof. They whispered names, not spoken in this generation's secret names, shameful names. Mama Mars heard one whisper her childhood name, a sound that made her arch her back as if she'd been struck by lightning. "They're pulling memories now," she said, her voice a ragged moan, "stealing the very breath from the living to feed the dead. They want our ghosts before we're even gone." The kitchen faucet began dripping blood. It wasn't a metaphor, it was thick, arterial, and hot. It stained the white porcelain sink in long, jagged streaks, and smelled of rust, rot, and the metallic tang of a fresh kill. Malik wiped it with a towel, his movements frantic, only to find his palm marked with a strange glyph, burned into his skin as if by a branding iron. The glyph shimmered with a sickly, iridescent light when he screamed, the pain radiating up his arm in waves of white-hot electricity. The animals knew before the humans did. Crows perched on the power lines outside, like a funeral shroud. They didn't move for days, their black eyes fixed on the house with a terrifying, collective intelligence. A cat was found, clawed open on the porch, its insides rearranged into an intricate, beautiful spiral of gore. Sam recognized the shape it was from an old protection spell he'd seen in the mirror's visions, but it had been inverted. It wasn't meant to keep things out. It was meant to keep them in, to trap them in a loop of eternal suffering. That night, as lightning cracked over Cedar Block like a whip across the sky, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. The air was so thick with spiritual static that Sam could taste the salt on his tongue. Serenity stood in the center of the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the flickering blue light of the storm. She had drawn a circle of salt around her feet, her breathing shallow and jagged. A shotgun lay on the table next to a Bible that was literally bleeding red at its spine, the holy words being drowned in a tide of ancestral ink. "Something's waking up," she said, her voice trembling with a terrifying certainty. And it remembers all of us. It remembers the taste of our fear, Sam. It's been dreaming of us. She looked at him, and for a second, the fear in her eyes was replaced by a dark, desperate hunger. The look of someone who knew they were about to be consumed and had decided to enjoy the heat. The lights flickered and died, leaving the room in a strobe-like chaos. Malik entered, his shirt soaked through with sweat that made the fabric cling to his muscles like a second skin. He was carrying a bundle wrapped in old, rotting rags that smelled of the grave. "This was under the shed," he said, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He unwrapped it with trembling hands, revealing a human jawbone, still stained with fresh, wet blood. It didn't just sit there. It seemed to vibrate, the teeth clicking together in a silent, mocking laughter. It smiled without lips, a wide, skeletal grin that promised a reckoning. From the corners of the room, the shadows didn't just lean in. They began to manifest. The air grew cold, then hot, then cold again. Sam felt a hand cold as ice and heavy as lead traced the line of his spine. A voice, sounding like 1,000 dead children whispering at once, filled the kitchen. "The debt is hungry, Samuel, and the house is the mouth." The floorboards beneath them groaned and began to leak a thick, black bile that smelled of overripe lilies. The house wasn't just settling, it was folding in on itself, the walls becoming soft and fleshy. Sam reached for serenity, their fingers locking together in a grip that was more about possession than comfort. The bone key in Sam's hand began to glow a violent, blinding red, the heat of it searing through his palm and into hers. They stood in the dark, the center of a storm that had been brewing for centuries, while the jawbone on the table began to hum, a lullaby that Sam recognized from the mirror. It was the song of the end, and as the shadows touched his skin, Sam realized with a jolt of insane clarity, the house didn't want them dead. It wanted them to become part of the foundation.
Cedar Black. Horror on Cedar Black.
If you thought Cedar Block was just a story, you haven't heard it breathe yet. The shadows are growing deeper. The spirits are getting louder. And the fire beneath the floorboards is still burning. Now, you can experience horror on Cedar Block like never before. The full audio experience is now available on Spotify. Immerse yourself in the voices, the whispers, the rituals, the reckoning. Whether you're driving at night, sitting in the dark, or walking alone, Cedar Block is coming with you. Search horror on Cedar Block on Spotify and follow the series so you don't miss what rises next. Because on Cedar Block, blood remembers, spirits rise, and the story is just beginning.